My name's Daniel. I know some of you guys. Some of you guys I'm seeing for the first time. I have been writing JavaScript for a while and doing all sorts of other, back-end to front-end development. I'm giving a talk, the title of which is Backbone.js, the framework that isn't. And if you saw the abstract on the website, you may be expecting a deep, highly technical dive, which is not actually what I'm doing. It's a talk about Backbone. It's a talk about controllers. It's a talk about what people mean when they say opinionated when it comes to technical things. And I hope you find something interesting in it. And if you don't, feel free to interrupt me at any point and, ask me a question that'll lead to something that does interest you. This is the first time I've given this talk, and I appreciate you helping me workshop it, so to speak. Can everybody hear me all right? All right. So this is a picture and a logo. So there's a lot of hot client-side frameworks, right? Raise your hand if you've worked with one of these in a moderately sized project or even a hobby thing. Okay, so a lot of people. And how about Backbone? Who's used Backbone? Okay. Backbone's pretty popular. It seems to be, I don't know if I want to say dominant, but definitely right up there as far as client-side frameworks go. And I think it's worth sort of comparing to the rest and thinking about in this light. So everything is opinionated when it comes to frameworks. I don't know if you guys recognize this opinionated person, but he was involved with Merb and Rails and Sprout Core and now Ember. And I saw him give a talk on how opinionated frameworks are good, right? Frameworks that make decisions for you and lay down patterns for you to follow are good because it lets you focus on the important things of solving your customers' problems, building your app, saving the world, whatever. So all those frameworks that I listed before are opinionated, but Backbone is different. Hold on my notes. Backbone is kind of opinionated, right? So Backbone does not come like a lot of these other frameworks with a set of, this is the way that you should organize your business logic. This is where you should put your files. This is how they should communicate with each other in the way that something like Ember or the server-side frameworks do. And a lot of people say, it's missing features, right? It's not as complete. It's not going to help me get my job done. So this is its opinion. You should make your own decisions. And this is something that's easy. It's appealing to people like us that write software, right? Like we want complete control. But it is dangerous because you end up rewriting a lot of things that you shouldn't have to, right? Like how many times, who here has written like a router more than once, right? Who of you people, how many more routers do you want to write? Exactly. And your components should work well together. Like anybody that's been writing, for example, Node.js code over the years has seen like the function patterns, like where callbacks go and where errors go change. And then you got code you wrote in Node 0.2 days and code you wrote now. And trying to use libraries that haven't been maintained, huge pain in the ass. So your components should at least all work together sanely. And one more important point, the important point, right? When you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you're a Rails or an Ember or whatever, Django app engine guy, then you want to solve every problem in those terms. And because these frameworks are opinionated, it means that they do some things better than others. And if you try and fit everything into that context, you might end up making more work for yourself. So I'm not trying to say that using these sort of opinionated frameworks is a bad thing. It's a great thing, right? If you know what the scope of your design is and the size of your project, your customer's goals and your deadline, and nothing's going to change, you know what you're doing? Sure. So if you know how to get from point A to B, what's between point A and B? So it's not all high level. There is code in this talk, so bear with me. And if you've built enough apps to know what it's like to get from point A to B, then choose something opinionated. Choose the right tool for that. Oh God, it doesn't go back. Well, anyway, my joke dog slide wasn't in this one. Shit. My original talk said software development is dark and full of terrors, and had a photo of a terrier, and everyone would laugh, and I would say, "Oh, not terriers, haha," and then go on to this slide. So imagine that I did that. So everybody that has done any amount of work, unless they're very, very lucky, has experienced a project that started as one thing and ended as another, or started as one thing and took many, many unexpected detours along the way, or changed staff, or changed toolkits, or whatever. And in my experience, this is more common than understanding point A to point B and the smooth road between it. So build your own framework. Actually, no, don't build your own framework. That's a terrible idea. It's one of those like rite of passage things that everybody does when they're 22, I think. And you learn something from it, but the main thing you learn is not to do it. But kind of build your own framework, right? Because you need to be able to react to, man, I wish these slides would go back. Hold on. I'm gonna go back out. I wanted to go back through some of the slides again. By the way, this presentation tool I'm using, JSLA, is the shit. It just takes a markdown file on a gist, and you hit a bookmarklet and blam, got your prezzo. You know what? It's in progress. I didn't write it. I actually thought I'd solve this earlier in the day because it wasn't going back in Safari. And when I switched to Chrome, everything worked. But this is Carlo's laptop, not mine. So I'm going to blame Carlo. Carlo isn't updating his Chromes. Yeah, not a value statement. M3, sweet. Terriers. Right, so you need to be able to respond to these things. And if you end up going way down this rigid path as defined by your tools, you might have problems with that. Like I wrote an API for a JavaScript front end in Sinatra recently. And then when I started having to deal with CORS, which is cross-origin resource sharing, you guys all know that. You guys are super smart. Then I like ran headlong into the limitations of the framework. It was phenomenally frustrating. And if I had used a little less opinionated tool, maybe that would have happened. So what do web application frameworks provide? Usually these things, right? All shorthand for what's my business data, what's the logic, how do I present it to the user? Great. And actually, this is kind of a cool picture. I'm going to take a little aside. This is a 9-volt battery. This is a T microphone for a mini disc recorder. And this is a giant wad of hot glue that is full of a bunch of electronic components that make it an amplifier. And so like this is the bulk of the controller, this wad of black hot glue. That's what you're building. So what's a client-side framework? Like what is that? How's that different from something like Rails or Django or whatever? God damn it. All right, well, my presentation is definitely skipping slides. But I've got my headings here, so I can just kind of be extemporaneous. So Backbone provides these things, right? Router, thin wrapper, raw models, collections, a view class, some sane defaults. Like that's not comforting, right? That's not everything you need to build an application. There's a lot of decision that needs to be made, but it all works well together. So even though I said that it wasn't very opinionated, it's still kind of opinionated. So as you try and solve your problem and you sort of start constructing your own framework using these simple tools, some things are slightly more natural than others. Right? So here's something really common in Backbone. And it's even supported by the way the default base view works. So this should say the base views constructor. When you instantiate a view in Backbone, some of the options that you pass it are magically set on the object itself. Like view.model will be Ruben. And what that's communicating to you is that you should attach models to views. It's natural to do so. And the idea is that the view and model are this clump that should know about each other's changes and react accordingly. So that is one common pattern when you're building something out in Backbone. And another thing is that in Backbone, when you're building something out, you tend to use events instead of callbacks. And if you guys are Node guys, you're familiar to this, to event emitter and handling streams of events rather than throwing the giant Christmas tree of callbacks around. In this code, for example, we bind to, whenever someone adds a model to a collection, we say, call this callback with this context. And then we've got, this is our add item view, and it takes care of some view stuff. In this case, it finds a div somewhere and appends a view to it. what that means is that anywhere throughout this view, as you create and add objects to the collection, as you perform, CRUD operations, you don't need to pass around a bunch of callbacks that have to go back and manage view state in a bunch of independent code. You're just binding to these events, and everything sort of takes care of itself. I mean, you can still use callbacks, and that kind of goes back to what I was saying about Backbone not being very opinionated, that you could pass a success and error to the same thing that calls these add events and tell it to suppress the events. And if that's the way you're comfortable, you can build up a whole set of helpers and glue around it and sort of do what you want. That's pretty much an observer pattern. So this is one of the opinions of backbones, and it's an opinion that is pretty common in the world of client-side JavaScript frameworks. But there's a whole lot of ways that you are free to be creative and sort of interpret your own infrastructure as a result. And I would like to have a big chunk of code here with like 5 or 6 different ways to tightly couple your models and views, but I'm sort of in the middle of crunch time right now, and I didn't get time to add that to my talk earlier today. So maybe you feel like it's okay, it's great to combine, and in case I didn't make it clear earlier, I'm sort of in my examples of patterns that are natural in Backbone section of the talk, as I described in the synopsis. So maybe, yeah, you're comfortable with binding your models and views closely, but you want more of a, like the model view presenter style, super fat controller / view that keeps track of user data and whether it's been tainted and whether it needs to re-render it and things like that. And because Backbone includes all this awesome stuff from underscore, like extend, which just sort of attaches, takes an object and extends its keys, what you'd think it would do. You could do something like this and just stick a user state object on, and then take your model and merge it when you want to render something to a template. And then you just have this thin little template with no logic in it. I use Mustache because it has no logic in it. It doesn't let me get too fancy. And then you, in your base model, you're doing all this work. So you notice like your views, as Backbone calls them, and they're views or controllers, depending on your terminology. I'm not going to give the like half an hour, this is real MVC, this is fake MVC talk. You might think, you know what, there's a little too much going on there. I don't like this big, fat, huge view. I want to take a different path with my app. Well, it's pretty trivial to kind of set up a different structure without really breaking any of the Backbone idioms or interoperabilities. Yeah, you can just cram it all into the router and have tons of global state, which maybe not the best idea, but as you can see, you're still sort of using the things that are comfortable in Backbone, the things that are natural to do in Backbone, and you end up with these like giant router functions, and then maybe on your app a bunch of template prepping stuff because for some reason you didn't want it in the view. Yeah, and so then when you render, you just do all this stuff in this callback, which I would not necessarily recommend. I missed the point is. Anyway, here's the point is. Backbone gives you some basic stuff, some tools that work well together that don't necessarily lead you down any particular garden path, except for maybe use events, tightly bind your models and views. And there isn't really a Backbone way, and I think that anybody that's not named Jeremy that tries to tell you there is probably selling you a book. That's fine, that's great. I think that we're all grown-ups here. We all have unique problems to solve, and I think that tools like Backbone are really useful for that. But if you know very clearly the scope of your project and what you're doing, maybe Backbone isn't the right thing for you because you are going to end up writing a bunch of custom code, like a big base view full of all your actions that define the way that you want to add things to the DOM or remove them or conditionally bind events or whatever. But I want to write that code. I don't want Yehuda to write it for me. But the point, if you're facing uncertainty and you expect to need to handle boring details, blah, 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 it might be a good choice for you. Again, I know that some of you may have come expecting a sort of a deep technical dive with lots of code on this stuff, and I would like to sort of evolve this talk into that as I give it and work on it. So the kind of the questions that you ask and the feedback you give me will hopefully help me flesh it out in a way that's interesting. That was only 15 minutes. I don't have a lot more. I mean, I will confess that when I planned this talk 2 weeks ago, I figured I'd spend a couple days working on it and then accidentally got crunch timed. But it might be a blessing in disguise. Maybe you guys have some feedback or some scathing criticisms or some questions that you can ask. And I mean, feel free to hurt my feelings. And does anybody have anything?
I have one question on Backbone. When using Backbone in the past, I've seen two schools of thought in terms of how to construct the views that reach into the DOM. Mm-hmm. And I'd like, not just your own, but maybe a couple other people's opinion on, do you grab the root element out of the DOM, or do you inject the root element into the DOM? Right, I've seen this done multiple ways, and
right. So what I usually do,
at every house.
So what I have done in the past, and what's been the most comfortable for me, is I'll have a basic app skeleton that I'll bind to with like a global app view that I'll pull, I'll extract and bind to that's in the DOM, and then that skeleton will have like a an innermost div like content or swap or something like that. And actually I don't, this isn't my computer, otherwise I would show you the code. But in my base view, I've got a sort of a long and overly complex one-liner that makes sure that that swap on render is properly unbind, removed, and destroyed, essentially garbage collected and then replaced with something rendered out of a mustache template or whatever. But in the case, that's for sort of screens, and then in the case of like lists, I'll insert into whatever's already rendered into that sort of innermost div. So I guess a little bit of both. Does anyone else have a comment on Travis's question? No? All right.
Do you ever face duplicated views and templates? You try to
duplicated views and templates in the sense that lots of copy paste, sort of. Is that what you mean, or?
Well, I guess. Well, let's say
are you talking about zombie views, like that don't get?
Yeah. Like, let's say you have like another framework that they're using, and you use Backbone on top of that. Mm-hmm. Does it? I don't know.
Oh, like double binding and things like that. So
yeah, I mean, do you get like duplicated views?
So I haven't had that problem, and I wish that I had that code snippet that I just mentioned, because I did run into some problems when I was trying to essentially swap content in and out of a div in place on the page rather than entirely writing new stuff in and removing it. I had issues with views that were zombies, like David said, or with things bound twice. But if you're careful about making sure that you completely remove and unattach stuff, I mean, I ran into it and then found a snippet that worked and haven't had a problem with it since. But I've only used Backbone in sort of from scratch Backbone, not on top of other JavaScript kind of. I mean, if it's pretty easy with, because Backbone is fairly flexible, it's pretty easy to, if you have a bunch of stuff that you've already written or you've used before, to just put it in like the initializer, like the constructor or the render of your Backbone view, and just have it run in the scope of that element. Because when you use a Backbone view, you get a $$ that's scoped to just things inside that view. And I feel like a lot of the problems that people have with stuff that gets bound multiple times or doesn't get unbound is that they're using global jQuery, etc. And if you make sure you're doing stuff within the scope of the view and using the view's scoped $, then you're going to run into way less problems. Carlo?
You said something really dear to my heart, that you use Sinatra, and as somebody who's not using Backbone, but your company uses Backbone. Like, are you thinking about rewriting all this stuff, or a lot of your talk was about a lot of negative things about Backbone? Are you going to stick with it, or are you going to rewrite a bunch of stuff?
Well, the thing is, I mean, if my talk came across as being about a lot of negative things about Backbone, then I definitely need to work on my communication skills / my sort of latent cynicism, because I think Backbone is really great. And I want to make it very clear that opinionated frameworks like all of the other ones that don't have these sort of attributes that Backbone has, are great, but only if you have a very, very clear understanding of the scope of your project, and that the pain of running into the edges of Ember, whatever, Angular, what have you, is so much greater than the upfront pain of having to write a little bit of custom glue code that is probably going to be unique to your, I mean, unless you're writing like the millionth blog application or something, right? But I mean, everybody hopefully is solving unique problems and moderately unique problems. You know what I mean? Your problem is unique to you, and you should own it top to bottom. You shouldn't have to write your own like XHR object or whatever. But if it's important to your problem domain, you should understand exactly how it works. And so we don't plan on leaving Backbone. We plan on sticking with Backbone. One of the people that recently came on to work on the project, I won't name names, went from a Backbone skeptic to, yeah, I'm starting to understand this Backbone thing. It's looking all right. Over the course of like a week of looking at my, hurriedly written code. So I'm happy with it. We're happy with it. As far as you mentioned Sinatra at the beginning, though, definitely moving on from that. But still, it was good for, the prototyping and the time that we used it for. Anybody else?
We're talking about the edge cases of the other frameworks. What would be the edge cases of Backbone which you not use it?
Okay, I would say that if you have, as I mentioned in the talk, if you have a very clearly understood problem domain, and especially if you have a short schedule, right? If you're on a short timeline, you just kind of accept the limitations in the same way that you drop features or simplify your application in general. If you're on a very short deadline, you just accept the fact that I'm going to do things the Angular way. It's going to look like the tutorial, and if it's not easy to do in the idioms of that framework, then it's not going to be in. You wouldn't want to use Backbone for something like that because.
I mean, where does Backbone?
Oh, I see what you're saying. What is the edge that you hit in frustration? That's a really good question. I'm a little bit Pollyannish about Backbone, even though it seemed like I was ragging on it a little bit. I really like it. I would say that if you don't have full control over the backend, if you're not running your own API, or if you are in an organization where you've got sort of like a change process, so you don't have tight communication between your front end and back end developers, Backbone's opinionatedness will end up with you writing overriding a bunch of core stuff that you shouldn't have to override. Like there's a sync method in Backbone that handles saving and.
Can you tell us what you think about the sync method? Very opinionated.
I have full control over my API for this project and the last project I did with Backbone, and I have decided to embrace the Backbone way. As expressed by the sync method, right? I said there was no Backbone way, but I don't want to. So the sync method, for those of you that don't know, is this sort of underlying engine of talk to the API, store, refresh, make sure that the client and server agree and have the same kind of state. No, it's just by default, just a bunch of REST. There's no streaming built in, as far as I know. I haven't used it if there is. But it does things in a certain way, and in big letters in the Backbone documentation it says, sync by default does this and is very simple, and you can and should override it. And that is definitely a pain point. And that's kind of what I was getting at with, if you're not really in the loop with the backends, you're going to end up like overriding this thing in the very guts of a Backbone that has ramifications in all of these other components, that it's maybe easier just to make your Backbone behave differently, or your backend behave differently.
So if I'm getting it right, it would not be good to write the classic real-time chat app in Backbone.
Yeah, I mean, if you did that in Backbone, you'd end up like using the views rather, because I like using the views because they do a very good job of scoping, event binding, and like cleaning themselves up and things like that. But you'd end up using the views, maybe 2 lines in the router, and then a bunch of custom polling or WebSockets code. So yeah, that's another good point. Like if you're doing some fancy, fancy is the classic example, right? If you're doing like streaming stuff, it's maybe you're going to write a bunch of custom code.
I did a real-time chat demo in Backbone, and I actually really enjoyed using Backbone to do that. I thought it was really cool with not having to micromanage stuff with jQuery or something, and to be able to just use Backbone to do that. So
What parts of did you use? Pretty much the whole library, or did you use pieces
I
of
used
it?
models and views. There wasn't a lot to do in the controller, other than once you get a message, then to shove a model into the collection, and then re-render the collection as your whole chat window. And that was how I was doing it. And then I optimized by saying, actually, don't re-render the whole thing, only re-render this piece right now that you have a new one, and add that to the DOM. I really like doing that.
That's great to hear. I mean, I'm not trying to scare people away from using Backbone for whatever they want. Obviously, you can use it for this real-time stuff as well. And I think that what that really, the point that really makes is that these like four, and I point at this as if they're still listed up there. The router, which is like 10 lines of code, and the models and the views, and the event stuff, they're all really solid in and of themselves, and they work together well. But I mean, it's very easy to mix and match, and that's what makes it not really a framework the way that the other frameworks are. I mean, I don't know if you could take the stuff from example Ember that sort of puts crazy, at least it did 6 months ago, 6 months, maybe less, crazy stuff in the DOM and all sorts of data bound to elements and things like that. And it's hard to take pieces of a framework that's designed top to bottom that way and use them piecemeal in a bigger project.
When you said that you guys are moving more into Backbone, with your other app that didn't have Backbone yet, I'm imagining that it had a lot of jQuery and Ajax.
Which app? I'm not sure. I said I wrote a couple Backbone apps recently, but.
Oh, okay. Well, okay, then maybe you didn't have like an older other app that wasn't using Backbone. Let's say that you did have an app that didn't have Backbone,
right?
And it had like a lot of jQuery and callbacks and Ajax. Would it be hard to like convert it into Backbone, or did you ever have to go through that process?
Oh, it kind of depends on how it's structured, right? If it's a classic kind of single-page app, you probably already have your own sort of means of organizing pieces of template, pieces of controller-like organization of stuff and views. And because these parts are easy to break apart and use separately, you could say, okay, we're going to use Backbone views first and kind of use them in our jQuery callback structure, and then use them to handle our event binding, and then sort of take a step, a little bit, and then maybe add models and maybe use the Backbone router. But you'd still get the benefits. I think the big benefit, as I kind of alluded to in the slide, one of the big benefits of using Backbone is the really nice way that you can integrate models and views with events and the way those events are handled by the framework. All right, so I told Jason and Carlo that I would talk for 20 minutes, and it's been 25. So unless there's anything really urgent, thanks.